Hi, this is a video that I've been planning since I heard they were going to release this model here in the Eagle Moss collection. I wanted to do an overview because it's me, it's Misha, and I love kind of comparing and contrasting and talking about histories, be they real or a smidge on the imaginary side. Why not, huh? So I wanted to compare the three Vipers we've seen in Battlestar Galactica, and this is really all except for one variant, which is sort of there and sort of not. I'll talk about. Over on the left, we have the Mark I, which is from the original series, and also is kind of featured in a cameo in the Reimagined. Is a very old version. Then we have the Mark II, which is old by the standards of the Reimagined series. The Mark I was kind of a pre-First Cylon War model, and then it worked, and it was used throughout the beginnings, especially of the Cylon War, but it was phased out in favor of the Mark II during the Cylon War. This was predominantly the space superiority fighter during that war, and even a little ways after. And then we skip all the way forward to the Mark VII. This is the standard superiority fighter before and at the beginning of the Second Cylon War. I think calling it a war is a little bit of a misnomer because it's more of a just complete ass-kicking, but hey, do what you gotta do. So we have the 1, the 2, and the 7. What about the ones in between? Well, we don't know really anything about the 4, 5, and 6. We do know a smidgen about the Mark III Viper. What we know is it's basically a Mark II, just a little bit fancier, a little bit larger, and it was made at the tail end of the Cylon War, the first one. So perhaps it wasn't as successful, or because the war was ending, it never got put into production in high numbers. Anyway, we know about the Mark III in small amounts. The 4, 5, 6, that just happened during the intervening years. That's about all we know. All of these ships have a very similar layout, so they can launch from the tubes of a Battlestar, kind of a standardized system. They're long and narrow, with a tri-wing design, 3 engines usually in the back. They're usually the longest dimension, or the largest dimension is front to back, then side to side, and then finally top to bottom they're very small. They are, generally speaking, single-seater craft, although in the original series we saw a couple of 2-seaters. They are not FTL capable. They are sublight. On the other hand, they are atmospheric as well as space superiority. Most have 2 forward-facing weapons. In the original series, it's lasers. But in the Reimagined, it's kinetic energy. In other words, cannons, guns. Although the Mark VII has 3. Also, these are capable of carrying missiles and bombs, different degrees, and other payloads. And they have a certain storage bin for cargo. They can also carry a spacesuit for EVAs and such, and they have ejection seats. All Vipers here are space superiority, kind of multi-role fighters, like an F-16. They're just kind of updates. Well, let's look at the Mark I. I don't really know dimensions because we never see this flying in the Reimagined, and of course data in that sense from the original series isn't really applicable. What we can kind of know about it, this, as I said, was in service before the First Cylon War. It was originally made as kind of an anti-piracy, a police craft, a border patrol craft, Just a general military craft. It was very advanced for its day and time. Had a lot of avionics, computer controlled, even had AI on board. It was very fast, which was also kind of its downfall. It was a little hard to control. It also burned through fuel. Now, it was capable of refueling to some extent. It had collectors. It could collect gas and particles in space or in the atmosphere to replenish its engines, but it burned faster than it could replenish. Because it was so heavily dependent on electronics, when the Cylons, machines, were the enemy, and because this was quite expensive and time-consuming to mass-produce by the standards of war, we went to the Mark II. This is kind of the opposite of a technological craft, aside from, being in space, that minor point. It's kind of a steampunk, retro. It has very, very little electronic, no real computer systems aside from a very basic. Think of it as having like an Apple IIe. The controls are analog, as are the gauges. On the other hand, it is very intuitive for pilots. It's also very fast and maneuverable, like its Forerunner, but a little more controllable and a little more intuitive for being a simpler design. Not only did they delete a lot of the fancy features from it to prevent Cylons from infiltrating it, but also because they could crank these out in the hundreds and thousands for war. Before the war, Battlestars would carry 70, maybe 100 Mark I's. Once we got into the war several years, Battlestars carried at least a couple of hundred, maybe even several hundred Vipers. So this was a simple, durable craft, again capable of atmospheric as well as interstellar flight, but not FTL. Like the Mark I, it has 2 forward-facing guns, as I said. It has landing gear. It's a fighter in space. And we do know its size. It was about 28 feet tip-to-tip, with a wingspan of about 15 feet. I forget the vertical, but I think it's around 9 feet, give or take. So, about the size of actually about the room I'm in right now. Kind of a large, normalish living room. Again, they wanted to get these on board ship, and they wanted them produced quickly and effectively, and able to train people on them quickly because it was wartime. Well, again, the Mark III was the same as the II for all intents and purposes, just maybe a foot or, maybe a couple of feet longer, a little higher capacity, a little more advanced, but we don't have a model of it. So let's get to the Mark VII that I just did a video on, but why not? The Mark VII is much more advanced, as it should be. It's a couple of generations later. These are again made in peacetime, like the Mark I, so they could afford to make them a little slower, a little more spit and polish. It's a little bit bigger than the Mark II. It's about 32 meters, and I said it again, sorry guys, 32 feet tip to tip, with a wingspan of about 18 feet, and it's about 10 foot tall. So just dimensionally, just a smidgen bigger. As I said, it has 3 cannons, 3 guns instead of 2. That's a major difference. It's a return to having avionics. They had the CNP, Command Navigation Program. It did not return to AI, of course, like the Mark I originally had, but it was getting much more computerized, including its control. It still had a physical joystick, of course, but it had digital displays, and that was its downfall because of Baltar's, okay, let's just be honest, because of Baltar's penis, people died in these. They were dead in the water. They were dead in the water, so he didn't have to be. What can you do? It's a much sleeker design, more modern, more aerodynamic. It had better atmospheric performance, unlike the Mark II. In space, of course, they performed about the same. This is because it was used as a patrol craft. It was more of a military because they knew the Cylons were out there. But they weren't as worried, so they used these for police duties again. It's just sleeker, more modern craft. I think it's funny, you can really tell by the canopy. If you look at the Mark I, it has a very retro sci-fi type canopy, which cracks me up. Kind of angular but multifaceted in the angle. Then you look at the Mark II, and the cockpit is basically ripped off from a World War II fighter plane, like a prop plane. Very square. Then you look at the Mark VII, and it's very much like a modern jet. It's rounded with very few obstructions, whereas this one has these bars. It's just funny. This is very clearly a World War II type plane. The fuselage is squared off with an intake. This one is kind of arrowed and tapered and very subdued intake. The engines as well. The Mark II engines are very large, kind of early jet style. The Mark VIIs are very small and kind of recessed. And of course the Mark Is are a little in between, because when they designed this in the 70s, they were trying to make it futuristic. When they designed the Mark II, they were kind of trying to make it retro-futuristic. And of course, when they made the Mark VII to be alongside the Mark II, they wanted to emphasize that it was a newer design, but newer wasn't always better. Just kind of neat, and I'm really happy that they gave the homage to the original, but they also did their own thing. That series really hit a nice... it wasn't too nostalgia-driven, but it also paid tribute without feeling like it ripped off. And these models are really nice. The Mark II is very heavy and chunky, lots of metal. The Mark VII is lighter, sleeker, and it really appears like it's smaller, even though in reality, well, the reality of the show, it's a larger ship by a little bit. But I actually measured this before starting the video, and it's kind of well, for you it might be an optical illusion. For me, it's just kind of a sensory illusion. Really, this model, at least on some dimensions, length and wingspan, is a little bit bigger. Not by much, maybe quarter inch, half inch compared to this, but I think it's because this is so chunky and this is so streamlined, and this one has more polymer, less metal. It's a much thinner design. It just seems like it's smaller, but actually they scale quite well, as does the Mark I. And this one's kind of in between the two. It does have quite a bit of metal, but it is sleeker. In a way, it kind of looks like it should be between these two. As funny as that is. But considering the story of the universe, it makes sense why they would go technological, then primitive, and then back to almost as technological years later. But these are really cool. I honestly, when I heard about this series of models, I was disappointed they didn't do any more Battlestars than what they've done, just the Galactica. I'm not as big a person into fighters. I like ships. But after holding and, okay, maybe a little bit of playing with these, I had to change my mind. They are quite substantial, detailed, and they're just really fun and neat. And I like it when collections give us the whole set. Now it's time to get a Raptor to join these. Maybe a couple other Cylons. And then we need to get the Pegasus, the original Galactica. I'd really like to see some more obscure ships like the Battlestar Valkyrie. I kind of like obscure ships in collections. And based on Eagle Moss's track record, they do the best with the most obscure ships. It's kind of funny, but it just is what it is. Yeah, but these are surprisingly worthwhile and a lot of fun. At least, to me. your mileage may and probably very will vary, because the way I view, literally, models like this is probably different than what you do. I like tactile detail. I like weight and something that feels sturdy, like it's not going to fall apart. Things like paint and coloration obviously don't matter to me. And it's not like I've made an active decision. It's just, how the cookie crumbles. But yeah, I think the Viper story is pretty neat. I will end this by saying, with the Mark I's, we only see one surviving the Cylon destruction of the colonies. There might be one or two more hiding out in the fleets. The Mark II's, 40 of them survived the destruction because they were 2 squadrons as part of the hangar display on Galactica, so they were reactivated. So we had 40 of these. Galactica, because it was still an active battleship to the day that the war happened, actually had a full complement of Mark VII's, even though it was an old ship. Because of the standardization of the tubes, they were able to use Mark VII's. Unfortunately, only about 6 or 7 survived. The rest were destroyed because of the CMP interference. So we had, let's say 2, just to be fair, Mark I's, 40 Mark II's, and we'll go ahead and say 7. Why don't we just say 50 Vipers altogether on Galactica when the war, began and ended. All right there. We can maybe assume a few more got picked up, but we don't see it on screen. But what happened when Pegasus joined in Season 2, about, 6-8 months after all this, Pegasus not only had a full complement of Mark 7's, although we never saw any Mark 2's, and it probably wouldn't have had any because it wasn't a museum ship. We don't know how many, but several hundred. Furthermore, we know that Pegasus had the facilities to manufacture new Mark 7's, and began to do so, and at least made 40 or 50, probably more, before it was destroyed and lost. So we know that several hundred Mark 7's joined the fleet, therefore dwarfing the Mark 2's, several of which had been destroyed by this point. So in the beginning of the series, we see mostly Mark 2's, and quickly by the middle of the series, the Mark 7 takes it over, although there were always some Mark 7's from the very beginning. I just think that's interesting and neat. I don't know why. It's late. I've had a good day. Hope you've enjoyed this video too. I was really happy this model came in today. They said Eagle Moss said it was due in February, and they didn't lie. It came February 2nd. So good on them for keeping their agenda. I can't wait to see what comes out around April, because these seem to come out about every 2 months. I am best pleased, especially with the fighters. I like the Galactica, but it does have a couple of issues, but the fighters are almost perfect. Really happy with them. Anyway, if you haven't checked out my other videos on these, you might want to do so if you're bored, or sick in bed, or hungry waiting on food to get there. That's half the time when I make these videos. Appreciate you tuning in. Would love to hear your own comments below. If you could, like, share, subscribe. And hey, if you like things with guns on them, check out our main page over at Mishaco. Well, this is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.